Okay, let's dive in. We're tackling a mind-bending figure today, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, specifically unpacking the core ideas found in your sources, the social contract, and later political writings.
A foundational figure for sure.
Absolutely. And this isn't about getting a degree in philosophy overnight, but about zeroing in on the revolutionary concepts that really shook the foundations of political thought and, still shape our world.
It's amazing how relevant these ideas remain.
Our mission for this deep dive: to cut through the complexity and grasp those essential ideas. The general will, what sovereignty actually means, different kinds of freedom, and what makes a legitimate state, all strictly through the lens of the material you've provided. Let's figure out what Rousseau is really saying here.
Sounds good. Where do we start?
So right from the start, Rousseau asks a fundamental question in these sources. Why do societies even form? And what gives anyone the right to rule over another? He's pretty upfront, isn't he?
Oh, completely. He says legitimate authority among people isn't something you're born with, and force certainly doesn't create right.
So no divine right, no might makes right.
Exactly. It has to be based on what the sources say: conventions, agreements.
Right, conventions. That's the radical starting point then, rejecting natural hierarchy.
Yes. Any legitimate power, according to these texts, must come from an agreement, a convention among individuals. And that's where the social pact comes in.
The social pacts, that crucial agreement.
Right.
How do your sources describe this pivotal act? Is it just signing on the dotted line?
Well, the sources call it the most voluntary act in the world. By entering into this pact, each person essentially gives themselves and everything they possess, their forces, their goods, to the community.
Giving everything up. That sounds like a massive surrender, not something voluntary or beneficial.
But Rousseau argues it's the opposite. He frames it as an advantageous exchange.
Yeah.
Think about what you trade.
Okay.
You swap natural independence, which is, fragile and driven by immediate desires, for genuine freedom that comes from living under law.
So a more secure kind of freedom.
Exactly. You give up the power to harm others, but gain their own security. And instead of relying on your own precarious force, you get right made invincible by the social union.
Oh, okay. So your life in this civil state becomes dedicated to the state, yes, but also powerfully protected by it. It's a transformation.
That's the idea, a fundamental shift.
Okay, so you gain security and a different kind of freedom. You mentioned natural independence versus another type of freedom. The sources specifically highlight moral freedom, which alone makes man truly the master of himself. How is this moral freedom different from that initial natural liberty?
This is a really key distinction for Rousseau. In the state of nature, you are governed by the impulsion of mere appetite. The sources explicitly call this slavery.
Slavery to your own desires.
Kind of, yeah, reacting purely to impulse. But in the civil state, under the civil pact, you gain moral freedom by obeying the law one has prescribed to oneself.
Ah, self-prescribed law.
Right. Freedom isn't license. It's self-governance. You are truly free when you follow the laws you have a hand in creating for yourself and the community.
That shift from being ruled by impulse to being ruled by self-made law feels profound. And that brings us to the concept that's probably most associated with Rousseau and often the trickiest to grasp: the general will. Based on the sources, what exactly is this general will?
Okay, the general will. The sources define it as that which wills the common good. It's described as invariably upright.
Invariably upright. But can it ever be wrong? I mean, is there some higher standard outside of it? Because if the majority wills something terrible, does that make it right just because it's the general will? That seems problematic.
Well, that's where Rousseau's idea is so challenging, and the sources address this directly. The general will isn't judged by an external standard of right or wrong.
Really?
According to these texts, it is the standard for that self-governing society. What a majority OF informed and public-spirited citizens declares it to be after free debate is the general will.
So the process defines the outcome.
In a sense, the source argues that if there were an external standard against which to measure the general will, then the case for self-legislation would be significantly weakened. Why bother governing yourself if there's an outside truth you should just be following anyway?
Huh. So the general will is the ultimate internal compass and authority for that specific group of people. It defines its own rightness.
Precisely, for that society.
Yeah.
And fascinatingly, the sources state that the general will remains constant, unalterable, and pure, even if individual voters sometimes seem swayed by private interests.
How can that be if people vote for their private interests?
The error isn't in the general will itself, which always aims for the common good. The error is when someone votes based on what benefits, say, this man or to this party, instead of what's genuinely advantageous to the state.
So the underlying principle is pure, even if the voting isn't.
That seems to be the idea. The rules for public assembly are designed to ensure the general will is always consulted and that it always replies. The underlying common good is always there, waiting to be correctly identified.
That's a powerful idea, that the collective good is a persistent truth, even if individuals mess up trying to find it. Okay, so who holds the ultimate power, the sovereignty, in this system driven by the general will?
Sovereignty, in Rousseau's framework from these sources, rests entirely and solely with the people.
The people themselves.
Yes, he uses people in a specific sense, meaning a people or a nation formed by the social pact. This very act of people becoming a people is called the true foundation of a society.
And this sovereignty is absolute.
The source describes this sovereign power held by the people as absolute, sacred, and inviolable, but importantly, always within the bounds of the original general conventions of the social pact.
Okay. Can that sovereignty held by the people be represented? Like, can people elect representatives to make laws on their behalf, as in many modern democracies?
Well, the sources are incredibly clear and direct on this, and it's one of Rousseau's most radical breaks from later political thought.
Oh.
Sovereignty cannot be represented, the text states flatly.
Cannot be. Why not?
Because it consists essentially in the general will, and the will does not admit OF being represented. You can't hand over your will to someone else. It's yours.
So, elected officials.
Deputies, like members of parliament, aren't representatives in Rousseau's view. They're just agents. They can act, but they don't embody the will.
And what about the laws they might pass?
Any law the people themselves haven't ratified in person, according to the sources, it is null. It is not a law.
Wait, null. A law isn't actually a law unless the people vote on it directly. That flies in the face of how most large countries operate today.
It absolutely does. The famous example the source gives is the English people.
What about them?
It says the English people thinks it is free. It is greatly mistaken. It is free only during the election, OF, members OF parliament. As soon as they are elected, it is enslaved. It is nothing.
Wow. That's a pretty scathing critique of representative systems based on this principle of indivisible will.
It certainly is. Direct participation is key for Rousseau.
So, if the people are the sovereign and their sovereignty can't be represented, where does the government fit into all this? Is the government the sovereign?
Fundamentally, no. Rousseau draws a sharp line here. The government is distinct from the sovereign people.
Completely separate.
Yes. The sources define the government as a strictly subordinate body responsible for administrative and executive functions. The people are the sovereign. The government serves the sovereign.
So the government doesn't make law.
No. And the source argues that trying to combine the government with the legislative authority, or making the sovereign into a prince, actually weakens the activity of the general will because the government's own particular interests can interfere.
Okay, so the government's job is purely to execute the laws that the people, as the sovereign, have created, like an administrative arm.
Exactly. The sources state, it is not good that he who makes the laws execute them. The people, as the lawgivers, should focus on general principles, not get bogged down in particular administrative tasks.
And why is that separation so important?
Well, the danger of private interests influencing public affairs is significant. And corruption of the lawgiver, the people, is seen as even worse than abuse by the government. Keep the functions distinct.
Does Rousseau, based on these texts, favor one particular form of government, like democracy, aristocracy, or monarchy, as inherently the best?
The sources suggest there's no single universal answer. It says each one of them is the best in some cases and the worst in others.
Depends on the situation.
Seems so. There's a guideline offered. Democratic government suits small states, aristocratic government suits medium-sized ones, and monarchy large ones. This seems linked to factors like population size and the efficiency needed.
But does he have preferences?
Well, the sources do point out that monarchy has an essential and inevitable defect compared to republican government.
Which is?
Republics are seen as more likely to elevate capable individuals based on merit, while monarchies often promote petty bunglers, petty knaves, petty schemers based on connections or favor.
Okay, that's pretty clear. Let's pivot slightly to something else mentioned early on and elaborated in the later writings. Property and inequality. Property comes up in relation to the social contract. What's Rousseau's view on property and, critically, inequality, drawing from all the sources?
Right, property is foundational to the state. Individuals bring their possessions into the social contract. The sovereign becomes the master of these goods, but in doing so, it transforms mere possession, maybe just holding something, into legitimate, secure property rights for the individual. It changes usurpation into a genuine right.
So the state legitimizes property.
In a way, yes, but then the sources become particularly forceful when discussing the dangers of inequality.
That's so.
They strongly advise against tolerating neither very rich people nor beggars. These extremes are labeled as equally fatal to the common good.
Fatal. That's strong language.
It is. The idea is that extreme wealth fosters the supporters of tyranny, and extreme poverty creates potential tyrants or desperate people. Both destabilize the common good.
That sounds like a direct call for economic moderation. How does that connect with his ideas on taxation?
Taxation, according to the sources, should be proportional, but not just based on the amount someone has, what the text calls the relation of F quantities.
Not just how much you own.
Right. It must also consider the relation of F uses, basically differentiating between necessities and superfluities, or luxuries.
So tax luxuries more.
That's the implication. Someone with only necessities shouldn't really be taxed on those. Those with superfluities, however, could potentially be taxed heavily on amounts exceeding their basic needs. Taxing luxury items itself is also suggested as a less burdensome way to raise revenue, tapping into vanity, perhaps.
The sources also mention a wise economy that focuses on preventing needs rather than just maximizing revenue. What's that about?
Yes, a truly wise administration, as described in the sources, focuses on anticipating and preventing needs in the first place, not just reacting to shortages or problems.
Proactive government.
Exactly. They contrast this approach with modern fiscal systems, which they find lacking. Ancient governments, the source says, did more with their parsimony than ours do with all their treasures.
Doing more with less.
The real art of finance, according to this view, is justly distributing resources, anticipating needs, and sometimes taking apparent short-term losses for long-term gain. And there's a critical quote you picked up on.
The one about money.
Yes. Money is at best the supplement to men, and the supplement will never be worth the thing itself.
People are more important than money.
Fundamentally, the focus should be on increasing the food supply and the number of productive citizens through things like encouraging agriculture and making it respected, rather than just shuffling money around.
This shifts the focus from purely economic or structural measures to the character and well-being of the citizens themselves. How crucial are morals, customs, and the character of the people, in Rousseau's view, for a state to truly endure?
Oh, absolutely vital. Maybe the most vital thing. The sources describe this as a fourth kind of law, even more important than written statutes.
A fourth kind of law.
Yes, one graven not in marble or in bronze, but in the hearts of the citizens. This is considered the state's genuine constitution, capable of reviving or replacing other laws as they weaken or become obsolete. It's the living culture.
So civic virtue and the character of the people are the real bedrock, more than institutions.
Precisely. The sources powerfully state that the fatherland cannot endure without freedom, nor freedom without virtue, nor virtue without citizens.
Freedom, virtue, citizens, all linked.
Inseparably. The success of a state hinges on forming citizens. Otherwise, you end up with nothing but nasty slaves, even if they follow the laws externally.
That makes sense. But how do you actually form citizens with that kind of deep civic virtue? That sounds like a tall order.
It is, and the sources emphasize that to form citizens is not the business of a single day. It has to start early. They have to be taught when they are children.
Education is the key, then.
Absolutely central. Education, according to the texts, must give souls the national form, and so direct their tastes and opinions that they will be patriotic by inclination, passion, necessity.
Wow, national form. That sounds intense.
It is. The ideal presented is for a child to see the fatherland and see only it until his dying day. It involves teaching individuals to see themselves primarily as part of the whole, to identify completely with the state, transforming potentially selfish or dangerous dispositions into sublime virtue.
The sources also note that a good education needs to be negative. What does that mean in this context? Not just criticizing.
No, not exactly.
Yeah.
It means focusing on preventing vices from taking root rather than just stuffing children with information or abstract moral precepts they don't understand.
How do you do that?
The sources suggest this is done by keeping children active, busy, not with boring studies they hate, but with physical exercise and games they enjoy. This satisfies their natural need for movement while simultaneously providing a moral objective, learning teamwork, rules, discipline in a way that feels natural, not forced.
Interesting. Okay, thinking about all these ideas together, the people as sovereign, legitimacy from convention and the general will, the sharp critique of inequality, the absolute necessity of civic virtue, and this very specific kind of education, how fundamentally did these ideas challenge the established ways of thinking in Rousseau's era?
Oh, they were profoundly disruptive. I mean, you have to remember the context.
Right, monarchies, aristocracy.
Exactly. Most political thought at the time was based on divine right, hereditary succession, or perhaps a model where people surrendered significant freedom to a ruler in exchange for order, like Hobbes might argue.
And Rousseau comes along and says,
He completely upends that based on these sources by placing sovereignty squarely and indivisibly with the collected people. The idea that the general will derived from the people themselves was the ultimate authority, answerable only to itself. That provided an intellectual blueprint for revolutionary movements based on popular sovereignty.
it wasn't just theoretical, it had practical implications.
Definitely. His critique of inequality and emphasis on civic transformation also directly challenged the aristocratic and class structures of his time. And he explicitly rejects common justifications for monarchy, like comparing the ruler to a father, or highlighting, as the sources do, the practical flaws of monarchy compared to republics in promoting talent. He was directly confronting prevailing norms.
It's clear how these concepts were revolutionary then, and as we've explored them, it's easy to see how they echo in so many modern debates.
For sure.
Discussions about the nature of representation, direct democracy versus representative government, wealth disparity, the role of the state in ensuring equality, the purpose of public education. These are questions Rousseau wrestled with deeply, and his framework from these sources offers a distinct and often challenging perspective for you to consider today.
And here's maybe a final thought to take away as you reflect on these ideas drawn from the source's description of the general will. If the general will, genuinely seeking the common good, can remain constant, unalterable, and pure, even when individual votes seem corrupted by private interests. What does that tell us about the constant challenge for any society attempting self-governance?
Mean it.
How does a community truly ensure that the general will is always genuinely consulted and that the society genuinely responds to it, especially when particular narrow interests are loud and seem to dominate the conversation? That's a question Rousseau leaves us with, and it feels as relevant now as ever.